The Caramel Forest, Chris Beckett. In the caramel forest, the trees are yellow, gray, or pink, with trunks, branches, and leaves all made out of the same smooth, mushroomy flesh. Every 50 yards or so, there are ponds, picked out by a lemon-yellow sunlight that elsewhere is filtered by trees. Around the ponds, spongy clumps of vegetation, white or yellow or pink, grow in the patches of sunlight. Elsewhere the ground is covered by a low, pinkish, mossy growth, which sometimes, in the shadiest spots, glows faintly with phosphorescence, even in the middle of the day. Everywhere is pervaded by the heavy, sweet caramel smell. Cassie could still remember the time when all this had been new to her. She could remember it seeming so strange that she'd found it hard to believe that she wasn't dreaming. Of the journey itself she had no memory. There was a blank space in her mind where the journey had been. And then a door had opened, and here she'd been. Here, suddenly, was all this. She'd grown accustomed to it now. These days, it was the world that she came from that seemed unreal and dreamlike, with its strange colors, its strange smells, its strange forms of life, somewhere out there across an unimaginable void that no one could ever remember crossing. As for Peter, her little brother, he had no recollection of anywhere else but this. So they pressed their faces to the windows of the car, trying to spot something more exotic and interesting than mushrooms the size of trees. "It's 5 points if we spot an animal," Cassie told Peter, "and 100 points for a castle." Castles were a very long shot. They'd only ever seen one of those, and that had been in ruins. Its brittle and madly intricate architecture had been kicked and stamped to pieces by settlers. All that was left of it was a jagged stump, and a few amber-like whorls and coils lying in pieces on the ground. No one knew how they were made, or what they were for. But no castles appeared now, and nor did any animal. The forest, with its spot-lit ponds, was an empty stage. The only thing moving out there was the occasional solitary floater, drifting through the space between canopy and forest floor, trailing its delicate tendrils and bumping from time to time against the trees. Peter pointed out each one, but Cassie didn't consider floaters sufficiently interesting to merit a point. "We must see 100 of them every day, Peter," she pointed out. "And, oh, wait a minute!" She craned round, thinking she'd spotted something moving next to a pond, some way off in the forest. But no, there was nothing new there, only the spongy shrubs shining pink and white in the sunlight. "Those aren't really ponds at all, you know," Cassie presently informed her little brother. "Under the ground, they're all joined up. It's really a sea covered over by a roof of tree roots and earth. Even under this road there's water." "Quite right, Cassie," said her father David from the front passenger seat. There were 2 kinds of agency people, one kind measured and mapped and classified, the other kind administered and educated and reformed. David was the first kind. He worked in an agency laboratory that was slowly dismantling the caramel forest as if it were a giant watch, and examining each cog and spring. "I wish we'd see some goblins," said Cassie. She turned away from the window to glance defiantly at the back of her mother's head. "I'll give you 20 points, Peter, if you spot us one," she added, resuming her scrutiny of the forest. "And I'll let you have a turn with my microscope as well. They do come out sometimes in the day." "We don't call them goblins, though, do we?" David reminded her. We call them indigenes. They're not supernatural beings, just living creatures like us, going about their lives as best they can. Cassie shrugged. Everyone at school calls them goblins. Most kids in your school are the children of settlers. Their people have been living here for generations, cut off from the rest of us, and without the benefit of science. But we're agency people, and we do have that benefit. More ponds, more silent empty space beneath the mushroom-like trees. The other kids say that goblins are only good for shooting and nailing up, Cassie said after a while. Well, that's just silly, Cassie, her father told her. Silly and brutal. Indigenes harm no one, and they were here for millions of years before the first settlers arrived. They give you funny ideas. David didn't respond to this immediately. They certainly seem to, he conceded after a few seconds of silence. No one quite knows how or why. Possibly it's their way of protecting themselves. Protecting themselves? Cassie tipped her head to one side for a moment and tested the weight of that idea. Then she set it aside with another of her characteristic shrugs. Well, whatever it's for, Must you talk about those horrid things all the time? Interrupted Cassie's mother, Paula, in a small, tight voice. It was almost a whisper. Paula took a corner a little too fast. There was a jolt as the left front wheel of the car bounced off the road into the spongy moss, and then back out again. They were beside a particularly large pond, almost a small lake, with the road running along the edge of it. David winced. "Be careful, darling," he said in a strained imitation of helpfulness. "We don't want to end up in the water." "Thank you so much for reminding me of that, David. It would never have occurred to— Hey, look at all those floaters together," Cassie cried out quickly. There were 4 of the things drifting close together above the water, trailing the long, lacy strands with which they were thought to gather moisture and microbes from the air. "Peter and Cassie had better play in the garden when we get back," Paula said, when they were back under the mushroomy trees. "I need you out of the way so I can get ready for the visitors. We've hardly got enough time as it is." She half-turned her beautiful, bitter face toward her children. "Honestly, Paula," muttered David, "I can't win. You keep telling me how bored and lonely you are, but when I ask some friends over, you complain about that as well. I thought you'd appreciate the company." "Yes, David, but it was just stupid to invite people to come to dinner at 6 o'clock when you knew that we ourselves would still be 2 hours' drive away at 3. David turned away from her without answering. "And anyway," Paula said, "my idea of company is people who might be interested in talking with me about things that I understand. Not 2 of your workmates who will talk shop constantly, leaving me out completely, and one of whom you obviously fancy, judging by how often you mention her name. For God's sake, Paula," David still didn't turn to face his wife, "what was I supposed to do? They called me. They said they'd be passing our way. They asked if we'd be around." "You could have said we were already doing something. You say that to me often enough." "Let's sing some songs," Cassie called out. Their home was a smooth, yellow, flattened dome set in the middle of a wide, bare lawn. The lawn was bright green, a color entirely absent from the rest of the caramel forest. Around the lawn was a white, 2-meter-high chain-link fence with floodlights on poles at 4-meter intervals. Juan, the caretaker, was outside his hut cleaning a gun. He laid down the weapon and limped to the gate to open it for them, nodding but not smiling as they passed through. "Boda, senara." He greeted them with a small, stiff bow. He could speak English well enough, but he confined himself, where possible, to the settlers' language, Luto. Paula stopped the car. Cassie jumped at it once and immediately organized a game for her and Peter. She was to be a famous explorer. He would be a wounded stray dog called Max that she'd taken in and healed. The car, on its fat blue wheels, would serve as his kennel. "Woof, woof," said the dog. Cassie frowned and held up her hand, thinking she'd heard something. "Quiet now, Max." It was odd. The one thing she did not want to hear were the sounds of shouts or sobs from within the house, and, in fact, if she had heard them, she'd have moved at once to cover them up with noisy play. Yet she still couldn't help herself from listening out for them. Listening, 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 while all the while glancing down the road back into the caramel forest, out there on the far side of the white fence, willing their visitors to arrive. But the forest, that silent stage, remained still. Nothing made a sound. Nothing moved. "We're in an alien world," Cassie informed her dog Max. "Where we come from, the trees are green like this grass, and none of the creatures can talk to you inside your head." A gust of breeze blew her wavy red hair about her face. Hearing a new sound, she held up her hand again. But it was just the wind chime in the yard of the other house behind theirs, the empty pink house, which, apart from Juan's hut, was the only other building in the vicinity. It was 5 miles to the next human settlement, and that was the settler village where the children went to school. "Come here now, Max, and eat this bone." "Woof," said Max. He crawled obediently across to her, and she ruffled his hair. "Do you know where dogs and people come from?" "Woof," said Max, shaking his head sadly. "Don't worry," said Cassie kindly. "You're only a dog, so how could you be expected to know? I'll tell you, though. We come from another whole world. Imagine that. Another world, with nothingness in between it and us. Just empty space, with no air or anything." "Woof," said Max. "And that empty space is so big that— Oh, wait a minute. Here are the visitors. Look. You'd better be Peter again." Almost every night, through the thin wall of her room, Cassie would hear her mother crying. "I hate this place. I hate this stinking forest. I'm so lonely. The kids are driving me nuts." "Shh," her father would hiss after a few minutes. Their voices would drop for a bit after that, but sooner or later Paula would raise her voice again. "Of course the kids don't bug you when you're away all the time," she might say. Or, "But they're driving me crazy, really crazy. Don't you even care?" Or, "We hear all about your work, but what about mine? Why doesn't mine matter?" "Shut up," Cassie would mutter on her own in the dark, for Peter would be sleeping peacefully in the room on the other side of hers, oblivious to all this. "Shut up, shut up, shut up." She'd put her fingers in her ears and mutter, "La la la," to stop herself hearing, and she'd try and think about things that had nothing to do with this house or her family, like that immense expanse of nothingness that divided the caramel forest from her home, that dreadful, enormous, hollow emptiness that somehow they'd crossed, even though she had no memory of it, and no one could really explain how it was done. If she could only fully understand the scale and nature of that gigantic emptiness, she told herself, this little house, this little local difficulty, would cease to have any consequence at all. It was a bleak sort of comfort. But right now, there were the visitors to attend to. "Sorry about the short notice," said Ernesto, a very small man with a large mustache. "But it seemed a shame not to call when we were in these parts." "Hope we haven't put you out," said Shima, a rather pretty dark-haired woman a head taller than her companion. "Oh, wow! Look at this spread. You shouldn't have gone to all this trouble." "Nonsense, nonsense!" cried Paula. "No trouble at all. Lovely to see you. We'd have been most offended if you'd passed this way and not come to see us." Standing in the background with Peter, Cassie watched her mother with narrowed eyes. Paula was smiling. She had laughter in her eyes. But Cassie had learned that this meant nothing. You could be laughing and joking with her one minute, thinking that the time of tears and quarrels must be finally over. But later that night, you'd hear her crying in bed, picking apart the day, and saying how much she hated every minute of it. "My," said Shima, "what beautiful children!" Cassie accepted the compliment with a gracious inclination of her head, carefully scrutinizing this visitor, who Dad was supposed to fancy. Shima quickly quailed in the intensity of her gaze. "Such wonderful red hair, too," she murmured, as she turned hastily back to the grown-ups. "I suppose you're at school?" Ernesto asked her. "What do you like studying the best?" "Space," Cassie said. "And goblins." "Oh, my lord, I wish those had been subjects when I was at school." Ernesto turned, laughing, toward the other grown-ups. Space and goblins. Lately, Cassie had been thinking and thinking and thinking about that huge, empty space that lay between her and where she came from. It wasn't just the size of it that puzzled her, but what it was. How could so much emptiness be there? What made it? What exactly was a space with nothing in it? She couldn't say exactly why all this bothered her, but she thought about it sometimes until her head ached. As for goblins, they often came and touched her dreaming mind. She knew when they'd been, because they left a certain mood, a certain tangled architecture of feelings and sense impressions, intimate and alien all at once, like the caramel forest itself. She could always tell when they'd been, and if they stopped for long, her mother would know too, and would wake and fret and moan. Okay, Cassie's father conceded over the empty dinner plates. "They communicate with microwaves. The trees seem to act as antennae. They have an electromagnetic sense, and I suppose one can just about accept that this could make them sensitive to human brain activity in some way, but it doesn't explain how they interpret it." "They don't interpret it, Dave," Shima said. "They pick it up and beam it back to us." "You're not getting my point. They don't just beam back random signals, do they? They're able to home in on certain things, or perhaps just stimulate certain parts of—" Ernesto began. "And anyway, Shima," David continued, ignoring the interruption, "the beam it back to us theory doesn't explain how we manage to receive the signal." "It doesn't have to be a case of receiving or sending a signal," Ernesto persisted. "Just stimulating certain parts of our brains. They disorientate potential predators by stirring up uncomfortable feelings. They don't have to know what it is they're stirring up. any more than a chameleon has to know that the red thing it's sitting on is a tablecloth. Peter, too young to stay up, had already been fed and sent to bed. Cassie knew she would soon be sent off as well, even though she'd been allowed to stay up for the meal. Making the most of her remaining time, she watched the grown-ups with sharp, appraising eyes. There were so many layers to adult conversation, that strange, dull, sedentary, stripped-down form of play. Her father and his two workmates were talking more and more loudly as the evening went on. They all seemed angry, interrupting one another, loudly and impatiently, more and more, and yet at the same time they were smiling and having fun. Paula was smiling too, and even sometimes laughing, but she was drinking glass after glass of wine. "What you're missing, Ernesto?" David glanced uneasily at his wife, hesitated, then turned back to his friends. "What you're missing, Ernesto, what you're refusing to consider, is that this is a creature whose nervous system is absolutely nothing like ours. So how can it possibly home in on our uncomfortable feelings and stir them up?" He laughed angrily, looking first at Ernesto, then Shima, on whom his gaze hesitated for a moment, as if he was trying to read something hidden behind her face. Then he glanced uneasily at his wife again, just for a fraction of a second, before turning back again to Ernesto. "One can just about envisage," he said, "how an animal with an electromagnetic sense might be able to do this with related creatures with similar nervous systems. But with humans, how? We have a completely different anatomy. They don't even have neurons, as we understand them. They don't even have an analog of neurons. And yet somehow you're telling me they're able to reach right through the particularities of the human brain and locate the places where we keep our troubles. Okay, we don't understand the how of it as yet, David, that's true. We're hampered experimentally, of course, by ethical considerations. But that doesn't mean we can't—" "Are we ready for dessert?" cried Paula, in a loud, bright voice. She leapt up to collect the plates. Her eyes were shining dangerously. David glanced at her again, this time with a flash of real fear in his eyes, but he still turned back stubbornly to his friends. "Okay, we're hampered by ethics from progressing this, but the fact remains there is currently no even vaguely plausible hypothesis." "No, but—" "That was delicious, Paula," cut in Shima, looking with sudden concern at her hostess. "I'll come and help you." "Yes, absolutely delicious," Ernesto chimed in dutifully. "So, nobody knows how goblins get into our thoughts, then?" Cassie asked her father as the women left the room. "Indigenes, darling," said David, visibly irritated at being distracted from his conversation with Ernesto. "No, nobody knows how they seem to make some people have uncomfortable thoughts." "They don't make me have uncomfortable thoughts," Cassie said. "Ah, well, maybe you haven't been near enough to one," suggested little Ernesto, wriggling his mustache and giving her a friendly wink. "I have so, loads of times, here and at school. One came right up to the school fence a couple of weeks ago. It was sitting as near to me as Dad is now. I liked the thoughts it gave me." "Did you indeed, sweetheart?" said her father, glancing at Ernesto and raising one eyebrow in an odd theatrical way that Cassie knew was only made possible by the presence of visitors. Cassie shrugged. "I liked being near it," she repeated, "but the other kids threw stones at it." David laughed uneasily, glancing again at his friend. "Nearly time for bed," he told her. "I haven't had my dessert yet." "Straight afterward, then," he said. He began to talk to Ernesto again in words that she mostly didn't understand. 2 weeks ago, when she'd been asking a teacher some of her difficult questions about space, the teacher had asked Cassie to imagine a peculiar thing. "Imagine there were creatures," he'd said, "that lived only in 2 dimensions, and imagine that a sphere passed through the flat space in which they lived. The creatures wouldn't be able to see the sphere, and in any case would have no notion that such a thing could exist. All they would know was that a dot appeared, spread into a circle, and then shrank back down into a dot again before it disappeared." Now, as she listened to her father and his friend, it made her think of those little 2-dimensional creatures arguing endlessly about circles that grew and shrank for reasons that their minds and senses were simply unable to apprehend. Or rather, she didn't exactly think about it, but the memory of that conversation came into her mind. It had been at the end of the week, and the settler kids were pushing and shoving each other in their haste to get out of the classroom and get back to their villages in the forest, and to their families, and to the lives that the agency and its compulsory schooling had interrupted. Not knowing of the existence of a 3rd dimension, they would have no choice but to go on, trying to explain the strange expanding circle in 2-dimensional terms, the teacher had said. The memory came into her mind and linked itself to the scene in front of her. On the one hand, the expanding and contracting circle. On the other, 2 little men arguing over a little table in a little yellow house under the stars in the middle of the caramel forest. Then Paula screamed in the kitchen, "They're out there again!" David rushed to his wife. Cassie hurried after him, followed a little more reluctantly by Ernesto. Outside, just beyond the fence, were 2 thin, gray creatures picked out by the lights. They were about Cassie's height, one squatting, one standing, neither one of them looking at the house. Both seemed engrossed in some object that the squatting one was holding up for the other's inspection. A shell, perhaps, or a piece of stone. "Make them go," sobbed Paula. "Make the horrible things go away." "Get a grip now, Paula," muttered David. "Remember, they're completely harmless, however spooky they may seem." Shima put her arm round Paula's shoulders. "Completely harmless, love," she said in a warm, kind voice, though Cassie saw her glance across at Ernesto behind Paula's back and pull a face that wasn't warm or kind at all. "All they can do is stir us up a bit." "Okay," said David, opening the kitchen door. "Let's just send them on their way, shall we, Ernesto? Then we can sit down and relax and have our dessert." There, Shima murmured soothingly to Paula. There. Remember, it's just a silly trick the goblins play. Just a silly trick they play on our minds. It doesn't mean anything." The 2 men strode toward the fence as if they were doing something brave. "Of course it means something," muttered Cassie, too quietly for anyone else to hear, as she slipped out of the kitchen door herself. Out in the forest, the ponds shone and the moss on the ground softly glowed. The stage was lit, and no longer empty. Whichever way she looked, creatures of many different shapes and sizes were moving under the trees. "Go away!" David kicked the fence and banged on it with the flats of his hands. After a few seconds, the squatting indigene rose very slowly to its feet. Then both goblins turned their narrow faces toward David, and regarded him with their black button eyes. Their V-shaped mouths resembled the smiles in a child's drawing. "Go on! Be off with you!" David shouted again. "You've had your fun. Now get on your way." Each goblin tipped its head on one side, but neither of them moved away. Behind them, far off in the softly glowing forest, a column of unicorns was making its way through the trees. Cassie started to walk down toward the fence. "Cassie, darling," called Shima after her, "don't you think you ought to—" But she had no confidence with children, and broke off. "Fear," said a voice in Cassie's head. "Fear and lies." It was the voice that always spoke in the presence of goblins. Her own voice, talking her own language, but speaking words that she hadn't chosen. Again, David banged on the fence. It had no further effect on the goblins, but it brought Juan out of his hut in his t-shirt and underpants, swearing in Luto, with a heavy pulse gun in his hands. He limped to the fence and pointed the gun at the goblins at point-blank range, barely acknowledging his employer or his employer's guest. "Be careful, Juan," David protested. "No need to—" Ignoring him, Juan pulled the trigger. The gun made a thudding sound like a beanbag brought down hard onto a table, and the goblins staggered and clasped their heads. "I think that was excessive, Juan," David said, as the creatures loped off into the forest. "You want them to go or not, Señor?" Juan shrugged and turned back to his hut. Cassie knew his children. They went to her school, and she knew that Juan hated goblins and despised agency people for protecting them. David and Ernesto walked back to the house. Cassie, unnoticed, followed behind them. "So," asked Ernesto, "what did you hear in your head, David?" "I didn't pay much attention," David said shortly. "I heard the voice telling me that I was a second-rate scientist with no imagination, and always would be," sighed Ernesto. "It's usually something like—" "I wish Juan would listen to me a bit more," David interrupted, "and do what I ask him to do, instead of whatever he happens to think best. The agency pays his salary, after all." By the kitchen door, he noticed Cassie's presence and told her to go to bed. "What about my dessert?" said Cassie. "We'll save you some for the morning." Some nights were sobbing nights. Some were sniffing and sniveling ones. But that night, after Shima and Ernesto had gone, it was the worst kind of night of all. It was a wailing night. "I can't stand those things, David. I can't stand them. Can't you see that? I just can't bear another whole year of them. Why can't you get that? Why doesn't it matter to you? I know you don't love me, but don't you care about me one little bit? Don't you care at least about the children?" "The children are fine with goblins, you know that. And please keep your voice down, or Cassie will hear us." "They're not fine with goblins. You really don't understand anything, do you? Cassie pretends she's fine with them as a way of coping and trying to keep the peace." "No, I don't," hissed Cassie in the darkness. "Stop lying about me. Stop lying." She banged angrily on the wall. Her parents' voices subsided immediately to a murmur, but she knew the wailing would soon start up again. "Run away, why don't you?" asked a voice inside her head. "Why hold on to this dream?" She went to the window. Sure enough, the goblins had come back. They were squatting side by side, with their backs against the fence. Cassie sighed. It was only a matter of time before Paula also sensed their presence, and then there would be no peace at all. "My dad said you had goblins round yours last night," said Carmela. Cassie was in her usual refuge in a corner of the playground close to the fence. It was a place where she could squat down behind a spongy clump of pink vegetation and be shielded from the general view. Juan's son had come over specially to seek her out. He was dark and wiry, with clever mocking eyes. Cassie shrugged. "Yeah, we did. I didn't mind, though. I quite liked them." Beyond the fence lay the silent, empty forest. "You quite like them?" The boy took a cigarette from his pocket and lit it. He was still a child, but he drew the thick, soupy smoke into his lungs in the manner of a habitual smoker of many years, and released it slowly with a contented sigh. He squatted down beside her. "Dad said your mom yelled and yelled when the goblins came back again in the night." "Yes, she did. We had to get your dad out of bed again to chase them away. Mom hates goblins." "Well, that makes one person in your family who's got a bit of sense." "Why do you say that? What's the harm in goblins?" "They slowly take over your head, agency girl. Slowly, slowly. Funny thoughts and dreams. That's just the beginning. Next thing you know, you've forgotten who you are, or where you came from, and then you belong to them. That's why we shoot them and string them up. We'd be goblins ourselves if we didn't." He drew in more smoke and regarded her with narrowed eyes as he let it back out through his mouth and nose. The two of them were still only children, but there was a certain electric charge between them all the same. Carmelo constantly mocked Cassie for her foolish agency ways, and she scolded him for his ignorant settler beliefs, and yet he often came on his own and sought out her company, when he could have stayed with the other settler children, or brought them all over to tease her, and she was pleased when he did. "But you're not allowed to harm goblins," Cassie said primly. "It's against the law. You're supposed to treat them like people." Carmela made a scornful noise. "Like people? We've been dealing with goblins here since long before your agency came along with its laws and rules. My dad says when he was a kid, every village had dried goblins nailed up on gibbets at the gates to warn the others away." He drew deeply on the cigarette, regarding her carefully. "Goblins were here long before you were," Cassie pointed out. Carmelo laughed as he released the smoke. "And we were here long before you, agency girl. And Yava gave us this world." Yava was the settler's god, and Cassie knew from experience that there was no point in discussing him. "You shouldn't smoke, you know," she said. "It'll mess up your lungs." "Don't do this. Don't do that." The settler boy mocked her, and took another deep drag. "You agency people are all the same." "Well, it is bad for you. That's just the fact of it." Carmelo exhaled. "Those goblins didn't come back again after their second visit, did they?" "No. Not after your dad chased them away." The boy snorted. "Chased them away?" "What? What's funny about that?" "He chased them out of your sight, more like, and then did for the two of them with an axe. That way he got to sleep the rest of the night, without your mom and dad yelling for him again every hour or so." Cassie stared at him. "He killed them?" "Of course he did." "But we didn't want that." "Oh, come on, Cassie. They're only animals." "How could they take over our minds if they were only animals?" But the boy had spotted a floater drifting in over the fence. Taking one quick final drag from his cigarette, he took careful aim and flipped the glowing butt end upward. There was a hiss of gas as the burning tip made contact, and then the floater sank, slowly deflating onto the ground. Carmelo walked over to it and squeezed out the remaining gas with his foot. One night, a month or two later, Cassie was woken in the early hours of morning by her parents quarreling yet again on the far side of the bedroom wall.
"Why don't you listen, David? I don't want to stay. Which part of that don't you understand?"
Cassie got up and went to the window. The lawn outside shone its unnatural green in the bluish glow of the lights around the fence. Far off in the forest, tall, shadowy, giraffe-necked creatures were moving round a shining pond.
"Why is it impossible, David? Why?" came her mother's voice. "Why can't you just go to the agency and say, 'Sorry, we made a mistake. We need to go home before my wife loses her mind, and my kids become even more weird and goblin-like than they already are'? Why is that impossible?"
Cassie considered knocking on the wall as usual. Her parents had already had one long row earlier that night. Surely they could see it wasn't fair to wake her up again. But she didn't do it. Something in her mind had clicked into a new position, though she couldn't have said why, after months and years of this nightly torment. Giving a little firm nod of assent to her own impulse, she pulled on some clothes and tiptoed quietly to the door. As she touched the handle, her mother's voice rose yet again in the next room.
"I know, David, but what you've got to understand is—"
Cassie closed her bedroom door behind her. Her brother woke with a start.
"Peter, wake up. We're leaving."
"What?" He always obeyed his sister unquestioningly, but he'd been deeply asleep and still wasn't sure where he was or what was going on. "Where are we going?" he wanted to know, while Cassie passed him close.
"Away from here. Mom's shouting at Dad again."
Cassie took the key to the compound from the shelf beside the kitchen door. Then they crept out across the grass. She slid back the bolt on the gate, very slowly and carefully so as not to disturb Juan, who luckily was a little deaf. Once she'd carefully closed the gate behind them, she led Peter briskly away from the brightly lit fence and straight off the road.
"Dad says you could walk 500 miles this way," she said as they headed into the caramel forest, "and still not reach another road."
All around them were ponds and phosphorescent moss, and creatures moving under the dim, mushroomy trees.
"Where are we going?"
Peter asked again, as he trotted behind her.
"I don't know yet," Cassie said. "But don't keep asking me, eh?"
From a pond straight ahead of them, unicorns emerged, scrambling one by one out of the bright water to snuffle and flare their nostrils in the caramel air before heading off in single file through the trees. Peter began to count them.
1, 2, 3, 4, 17,
Cassie told him shortly. About 20 ponds later, they came to one where a single, very small goblin sat at the bottom, lit by the pink phosphorescence of the pond's floor. The creature was not much bigger than a large cat, and it was staring straight ahead, apparently at nothing in particular, like a frog waiting for the motion of a fly to trigger it into life. Peter pulled at his sister's hand, troubled by the goblin's presence down there, and wanting to move away, but Cassie stood fast, and soon the little goblin glanced up for a moment, its black button eyes taking in the two children looking down on it from the air above.
"Mommy is going mad,"
said a calm, cold voice inside Cassie's head.
"Daddy is a scaredy cat who hides away at work."
"Yes, sirree," she muttered with a grim chuckle. "You got that right, my friend." Peter began to cry, and Cassie turned to him with a frown. "Go on, then," she said. "Spit it out. What did it say to you?" Her little brother just sobbed.
"Well, whatever it said,"
she told him firmly,
You may as well face up to it, because it's true. They don't tell lies."
Peter nodded humbly.
"So go on, then," Cassie persisted. "Tell me what it said."
"It said," snuffled Peter, "it said that Mom wishes I'd never been born."
"Oh, that," Cassie snorted. "Is that all? I could have told you that. I've heard it often enough through my bedroom wall. She wishes she hadn't had either of us. Spoiled her career, apparently, and anyway, she doesn't like kids. Come here, you silly boy. Come to Big Sis. I love you, don't I?"
She pulled Peter close to her, putting her arm round his shoulder in a rough, masculine way. 3 baby water dragons had appeared, supple as eels and slender as human fingers, and began to chase one another round and round the little goblin, which had resumed its original position.
"There you are, Peter,"
Cassie said, hugging her brother against her, and absent-mindedly patting him.
"There, there. That's better, isn't it? You've got me to look after you, haven't you? You've got your big sis, so you don't need them, do you? You don't need anyone else at all."
Peter sniffed and nodded.
"There's all the food anyone could want out here, after all," Cassie told him, giving him a little encouraging shake. "We'll be quite happy having fun out here all by ourselves. No Mom blubbing, no Dad whining, no horrid school with settler kids who think that killing things is fun."
At the bottom of the pond, the goblin suddenly swam off. In a single frog-like stroke, it disappeared into one of the underwater tunnels that linked the ponds together under the trees.
"Come on then, Trouble. Let's get moving again, before someone notices we've gone."
All night, with pauses for food and rest, they wandered through the caramel forest, Cassie telling Peter stories to keep his spirits up, or providing him with improving pieces of information, or making up games for them to play together. Who could find the biggest tree pod? Who would spot the next dragon?
"Why don't you be Max the dog again, Peter?"
she suggested when he seemed to be flagging.
"And then you can snuffle things out for us."
The show was in full swing all around them.
"Woof, woof,"
said Max, almost at once, spotting a griffin fanning a pair of incandescent wings that crackled with electric charge.
"Woof, woof,"
he said again, as a white hart darted away from them and plunged into the underground sea.
"Woof, woof,"
he shouted out, as an agency helicopter came thump, thump, thumping over the mushroom trees, probing down into the forest with long, cold fingers of light.
"Good boy, Maxie," Cassie told her brother. "Good boy. Now quickly, come and hide."
Not long after the helicopter had passed over, dawn began to break. The phosphorescent glow faded from the moss and the ponds, the stage emptied, and the 2 children found themselves walking alone through ordinary sunlight that filtered down through the trees, like sunlight did in the forests that Cassie dimly remembered from that place across the void. They lay down to sleep in deep, soft moss. When Cassie woke, the sun was already setting. Beside her, Peter still slept peacefully, sucking the edge of one finger, and for a while she just lay there watching the shadows of dreams rippling across his face, his eyes darting about under his closed lids. And it came to her that, during the quiet, still hours of daylight, creatures had come to watch the both of them in just this same way, for she'd had strange thoughts running through her sleeping mind, and a familiar voice in her head had been telling her that there was no faraway home, no great void of space, only the one single whispering, fizzing, seething world, strange and familiar all at once. From a nearby pond climbed a small winged quadruped, shaking its sparkling wings.
Come on, Peter, Cassie called out gaily. Wakey, wakey! It's another lovely night.
They were deeper into the forest that night, further away from agency stations and settler villages alike, and they came across many goblins. The creatures were sometimes on their own, often in twos and threes. They watched the children with their black button eyes and smiled their V-shaped smiles. One of them held out a white stone, another a piece of twig. One even showed them a small brown button from a settler's jacket.
"There is no space," said the voices in Cassie's head, as the goblin's eyes watched her. "There are no people. There is no such thing as far away." It seemed strange to her that she'd ever been persuaded to believe in an immensity of empty space beyond the caramel forest and its sky, for it seemed obvious to her now that everything that existed was as close as could be to everything else, close enough to whisper and rustle and murmur, close enough to touch. She looked at the button. She nodded. She turned away. Peter clutched her hand so tightly that it hurt. Several more times they heard the thud, thud, thud of a helicopter passing over the forest, and saw the agency searchlights sweeping officiously through the mushroom-like trees, leaching the color from leaves and trunks. The children just hid until they passed, surrounded by the whispering and rustling and murmuring of the caramel forest. Cassie had no desire to be plucked up into the empty sky. When dawn came again, they came to a castle. It was very small, about Peter's height, in fact, and looked at first like a little smooth stalagmite that had grown there on the edge of a pond. But one side of it was open, and they could see the intricate little chambers inside it, with their amber whorls and coils that enclosed even smaller chambers, and yet tinier whorls. The children gathered the spongy vegetation that grew around the castle and made themselves a secret nest nearby, well hidden from the sky. Then they found some savory chicken fruit to have for their supper, and a couple of toffee apples for afters. "Now wash your face and clean your teeth in the water, Peter," Cassie said when they'd finished eating, "and then let's get you settled down." She stroked his head and told him a story, while the sun rose in the sky, turning, as it climbed, from a syrupy rosehip red to pale lemon. "I'll look after you, my little bruv," she whispered to Peter's already sleeping face. "I'll always look after you." 3 goblins arrived. One by one they caressed the little amber castle and bent down to stare into its interior. Then they settled on their haunches on the bank of the pond, without even a glance at the 2 children. "Won't find your way back now," said the voices in Cassie's head. "Not if I can help it," muttered Cassie contentedly, stretching out in her improvised bed. Crack! There was a gunshot, followed by human voices and barking dogs. Peter lurched into wakefulness with a whimper. Crack! One of the goblins dived into the pool. Crack! A man ran to the bank and fired into the water. "Is all right now, darlings. We take you back to your ma," growled another man behind them in a thick Luto accent. "Goblins won't scare you no more." Cassie and Peter sat up. They clung together. The whispering and murmuring of the caramel forest was suddenly far away. "And maybe this time agency go listen, eh?" grumbled a third man, helping Cassie and Peter to their feet. "Maybe this time they go understand why goblins is bad." The air was full of smoke. These weren't pulse weapons that these men were carrying. They were proper old-fashioned guns, blasting out deadly balls of hot, hard matter designed to rip through flesh. Dogs came sniffling and snuffling, first round the children, and then, rather more interestedly,
round some smooth, grayish stuff that was strewn over the ground nearby. Cassie gazed at it, uncomprehendingly. "Don't worry about nothing," said the leader of the search party. It was one of dozens spread out across the forest, linked by walkie-talkie to the agency helicopters overhead. "Is only crazy ideas these goblins put in your head. That's all, only crazy ideas. They'll went away soon enough." He ruffled Peter's hair kindly and gave Cassie a friendly wink. She stared at him. The other men were breaking up the castle with their gun butts. One of the dogs took an experimental mouthful of the gray stuff, then sneezed and spat it out. It was goblin flesh, smooth all the way through, like the flesh of mushrooms.